We're so glad you're here, and welcome, friends. Thank you for coming. My name is Stephen Fetter. I manage the United Learning Program for the General Counsel Office, and it's my lovely opportunity tonight to have a chance to celebrate Ross's book with you. It's these are things. This is something we've just started doing, having these online book launches. Usually when you get together to celebrate the beginning of a book, everybody gets in the same room and we lay on the wine and cheese and we have a bunch of speeches, and then everybody gets a chance to read a chapter, and they have all the books for sale at a back corner somewhere. So we can't do all of that, and what a shame, but we'll kind of do the best we can. We've got a bunch of speeches lined up. We've got some conversation between Ross and me about the book, just to give you a taste of what's in it. And as I was saying earlier, if you hang in there, we have a time-limited promo code that Rebecca from the bookstore is going to tell us about right at the end of the program. So welcome. Welcome to this party. Our plan really is to be finished by the top of the hour, so this won't go on too terribly long. I'm going to watch the chat, and if you've got questions or comments that you'd like to have raised, the chat is the place to put it. We've got about 32 people in the room right now. We've had responses from almost 50, so that's just too big a group to kind of throw open the mics and make all of our comments orally. So put your comments and thoughts into the chat, and as we go along, I'll watch that and raise them up as we need to do that. So let me bring up Ross here, because I think if we're going to roast somebody, we need to have him on screen, right? Okay. Ross, we're excited to be able to celebrate with you. This is it's always significant to put so much time and effort into a book, and this is wonderful. So
thank you very much, and thank you for all of you making time to join us. It's great to have you here, and we wish we were all together in person and we could treat you.
Absolutely. So the book started out as a column.
Yes.
Lots of good books do. And Susan Lukey's on the line. Susan is the editor who kind of talked to Ross into this. And I just heard back from Susan about 20 minutes ago that she was going to be able to be here and that she had things to say. So Susan, we're thrilled you're here, and I think you should tell us a little bit about why you thought this was going to be a good idea and where it comes from.
Right on. Well, good evening, everyone. And Ross, I just want to say how delighted I am that we can celebrate the launch of this book with you. It started 17 years ago. I had to, yeah, but don't stop yet. It's not. I invited Ross about 17 years ago to join us in writing a column for Gathering. And it's interesting how 17 years goes by, because we do it issue by issue. We're focused on what would be helpful to people as they plan worship across the country and in other countries. And we just sort of do issue by issue, and suddenly it's 17 years. So it was the Advent Christmas Epiphany issue of 2004-2005 when Ross's first article appeared for us. I always look forward to receiving Ross's article bouncing from Halifax over to Alberta, where I live. And even though I've been preaching for 30 years, I just always enjoy opening it up and gleaning some inspiration, getting some insights that just spark my own preaching and help keep me fresh in my preaching. So I've delighted in that through the years, and I know that this book will continue that for people who are reading it. The Gathering family, this book is added to several books in the Gathering family that have been published through the years. And I was looking back, and it's all started 47 years ago with John Ambrose stapling together some pages, collating them, and getting it all together and mailing it out to all the churches across Canada. And so 47 years ago is when John did that. And here we are celebrating the continuation of that work and that family. So thank you, Ross, for being part of it. And thank you for this book.
Thank you, Susan.
Well, thank you, Susan. And I don't think I introduced you very well, Susan. So Susan is the editor of Gathering Magazine. And maybe for the one person online who's never heard of it, Susan, you should tell us what that is.
Haha, well, I have a copy, the Lent Easter
Nice.
Gathering magazine, and I see some, that write faithfully for us on here too. Gathering magazine comes out 4 times a year and provides prayers and inspirational articles, ideas for Sunday by Sunday preaching, sort of the complete worship service, music ideas, always explores a theme in each issue. This one's looking at end of life rituals. And it went from getting it all together to being Gathering, and has now been going for 47 years. And the exciting news, since we're putting plugs in, is we're working on Gathering online, and we're hoping to have a website that continues this work. Not the print edition will continue, but along with that, and along with Ross's articles, are keeping that going.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Susan. So, Ross, articles are really ephemeral, right? I mean, they're like sermons. You put them out there and then you forget about it before it's published. What was it that made you think that these had a longer life, these articles? Why did you want to collect them together?
Well, right from the very beginning, given the publication schedule and so on, it seemed that each article had to sort of stand on its own. So I thought about it as just being a 5-minute preaching workshop where we could raise up a particular issue, ask some questions, maybe provide some tips which would be useful both for beginners and long timers, and perhaps raise some thoughts about preaching. And over the years, I've learned a tremendous amount from MDiv students and also licensed lay worship leadership students. And they've responded to some of the stuff in the articles, and very well. That's very gratifying. And so I decided that it might be useful to put some of the most essential material together in between some covers. And because it's always really hard when somebody says, I'd like to learn more about, and you have to send them back to an article in a magazine that they may not ever have, or so it's all there together.
Well, and Gathering Magazine is that resource for our denomination where all kinds of preachers go week after week after week. It's such an important contribution.
Yeah.
Let me bring in.
It's wonderful. And I think it's worth noting that it's not just for the United Church of Canada, but it's actually, I don't know, Susan, how many countries it gets sent to, but it's just incredible.
So let me bring in Kate Rodd. Kate is the publisher, really. She's the one who looks at all the manuscripts that come into our office and says, nope. Oh, wait a minute, this one's good. So, Kate, of the 10,000 manuscripts you get, why did you choose this one? You need to unmute yourself.
Thanks very much, Steve. And it's so good to see you, Ross, and be at this point. So part of this was Ross's gracious and very patient efforts to get me interested in the book, and I looked at it initially and thought that could go or it couldn't, and over about a year I was at different book displays and in different places where people said, I'd love to have something small and easy to read on preaching. Said, I've studied preaching, I've got all of these big books on my shelf, but sometimes I'm stuck for something. And there's always a line that writers write books that they'd like to read, but in this case it was a publisher who published a book she'd like to have. And I'm not the only one. Chris Duma shares the publishing title with me. But anyway, when I looked at it, I thought, oh, and I went back over the submission a couple of times, and then finally almost 2 years later, went back to Ross and said, yeah, I think we have something here. I see George Baudon, and who knows all about resourcing lay worship leaders. And I thought, over the years, I've been asked to come to services as a speaker, and I was always asked if I would come to do the reading. And then about 2 weeks before, they'd say, oh, do you think you could do the sermon? I go, And, you know, I have grown up in the church and love this organization and been a very, I hope, good member. But I'm a journalist. And yes, I can tell stories, but not quite in this fashion. And I kept thinking, if I had had this, I would have been so much happier. So I think this has, I just saw it, and it was a lovely book to work with because Ross is a professional writer, and the columns had already been edited by Susan, and it made our life easy. Plus I knew that we were offering people something that they would really use. And this is now with another book, a much older book called Gathered in Worship, and it'll be part of a series that I think we're going to try and keep going. And we're just thrilled with it because I know it will be so applicable and so easy for people to read, to access, to get ideas. And thank you, Ross, for being persistent. And I'm delighted we're at this point.
Thank you.
So that raises an interesting question for me, Ross. Because, yeah, Kate feels like she's struggles with this, and yet she's a professional writer. She's a trained journalist. What's the difference? Why is preaching different from journalism?
I think one of the things that makes it very different is that it's an oral event. It's both spoken and heard. My students get sometimes tired of me saying that it's not a sermon when it's just a manuscript. It's not really a sermon until it's been spoken and heard. And when we are speaking something, there are a whole different set of dynamics at work, not least of which people can't flip backwards in an oral presentation and pick up something that they missed. So if you're going to say something, particularly if it's something important, you've got to make sure that you say it in a way that it can be heard and retained. And the structure and so on of the ideas and the flow of the presentation needs to be very carefully mapped out so that the readers can follow, but the listeners need to be involved and drawn in. And our capacity as a society for managing long oral technical arguments seems to have diminished. We have stories of Protestants in early Canada being able to listen to sermons for 3 hours.
Wow.
And apparently hang on to what was going on. Can't do that now. It's much more important for speakers to be organized and thoughtful and have things in some sort of logical sequence.
And yet words are important to you.
Words are true. I mean,
talk a lot in the book about the value of words, and you want crunchy words and sort of dynamic metaphors and memorable things.
Words are important. Words are important for us as Christians. After all, in our book, God speaks creation into being. There are words that are important. Jesus is called the Word of God or the Word made flesh. So words are important. We know very well that somebody who is called stupid or ugly or whatever it is often enough takes that in as their self-image. And somebody who is given a verbal image of themselves as vibrant or brilliant or attractive or whatever will take that on as well. I think one of the things that happens when we are not sufficiently imaginative and creative with our words is that the whole faith kind of becomes dull. We have these church words, they sort of fall to the end of the pew and they wave there limply and they don't really say anything to anybody. And so, if you've got a message that is about life and liberation, then it needs the words that convey that and that get us excited.
That's wonderful. I love this image of the words that are just falling limply at the side of the pew. I have sat through too many sermons where that happened. So thank you for that. I love the image.
Love, 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 love.
And the stained glass voice.
I mean, I fall asleep with sermons like that if I'm preaching them. So
well, I said this was going to be a bit of a roast, and we have gone out and collected a few best wishes from some of your colleagues, Ross. So I haven't shown any of these to Ross ahead of time, so you can watch his reactions. But the first one is from a colleague from AST, although I guess he's not there anymore. This is Lawrence DeWolf, who has lovely things to say, and I thought it would be a good place to start. So let's hear what Lawrence has to say.
Hi, Ross, and everyone. I want to say a big thank you to Ross, who's been a trusted and valued colleague in preaching for many, many years. Thank you for the book. Thank you for distilling all of your years of experience into these pages, and for gathering what you've written over the years and bringing it up to date. I appreciate especially Chapter 6 on preaching online.
Wow.
He's not the only one who is grateful for that, because of course we're all struggling with that right now.
Yeah, we are.
But one of the things that really hit me right at the beginning of the book, you were talking about how our faith has been preached from the very beginning, that it is not really a faith of writing as much as it has been a faith that has been shared in preaching and shared in stories. Say a little bit about that.
Well, right from the very beginning, the Christian story is a story that's told in words. For many centuries, one of the things that we don't realize is that having the arcane skill of being able to read also implied that you spoke aloud. So you read to people. There wouldn't be necessarily very many people who could read, and those who were reading would read aloud. And so the documents of Scripture were originally intended to be read aloud. Paul's letters, the Gospels, the prophets. These were oral things given to a community. And one of the changes that I think we need to keep in mind about the way in which modern technology and modern habits have changed the faith is the whole matter of the private and individualistic use of Scripture. So that Paul did not write his letters for me and my study only to be reading them. So often, one of the things that we miss if we work only in English translations is that you in Scripture usually means you plural, like y'all in the States or yous from here in the Maritimes.
Mm-hmm.
But we instinctively think of you as being me and my solitariness, or me and Jesus. And that changes the whole dynamic of the way we interact with these profoundly ancient documents. And while I love many of the modern translations, we forget sometimes that these ancient documents were framed in a way of looking at the world that's very different from what I encounter in my daily newspaper. And we need to, as preachers, try and convey some of that different way of looking at people and looking at the world.
And yet, if I ever read the word preach in a newspaper, it's not a compliment. How do you as a preacher cope with the sort of bad press that preaching gets?
By trying to do good preaching? I mean, there's no denying the fact that the negative comment on preaching arises from human experience of bad preaching, of lecturing, of haranguing, and so on. And so there's no real way of changing that narrative except by living into a different sort of vision of what the preacher is doing. But I think that even with all of the changes in technology and so on, there is still something in that historic practice of somebody getting up, opening the word, and relating that word to your life and mine that still has vitality.
I bet you that if I asked people on the chat to make a list of what makes a sermon bad, we'd have no trouble at all. But what would you say makes a sermon good?
A sermon, I think, increasingly feeling this way, a sermon needs to invite the listeners to do something. I, as the preacher, have to have some idea of what I want people to do as a result of hearing me. Now, I have no control that they're going to do that, but if I don't know what I would like you to do after listening to me, sure as blazes, nobody else is going to know. And that do is very broad. It can be thinking, it can be praying, it can be storming the barricades, it can be writing a petition, it can be all sorts of things, but wanting people to do something. And that something arises from the invitation of Scripture to God's people to act as co-creators in the new Shalom. And so, how are we going to do that right now?
Gee, I got too many questions about that, but I'm going to pause for a minute and share another one of these video clips. Partly because this is a book that I think is attractive not just to people like me who've been preaching our whole careers, but to people like Kate who preach once in a while, to people like the licensed lay worship leaders that you've helped with. So here's some best wishes from Christine Jarrett, who leads the licensed lay worship leader training course online.
Thank you, Ross, for writing Gathered for Preaching. I was delighted to be able to include it in the curriculum for the online licensed lay worship leader training course that is offered through Canadian Shield Regional Council and United in Learning. I know it will be a helpful resource for the lay worship leaders as they prepare to lead worship both now and into the future.
Oh, wow. Lovely. Thank you. That's great.
Well, it
Go
was
ahead.
really important to us to publish this book soon enough that it would be available for the new unit that started at the beginning of March on preaching. So
Oh, great. Okay, that's good. Yeah, the intention was that it hopefully would be useful for anyone who is called on to bring the word on in a worship setting, whether those are long in the tooth professionals like myself, or folk who are beginning their training, or somebody who is in a congregation and somebody taps them and says, I think you could do the sermon. And they sort of react like Kate did. And so this will hopefully give them some things more to think about than to actually do. The book, I hope, is a useful mixture both of useful to-dos, but also questions. I find the questions much more interesting, and hopefully people, having read a section of the book, will continue to ponder what the questions raised, say to them, because the message is within each preacher, and there are ways of making that message more accessible to the listener. And thinking about keeping that balance and that back and forth going in terms of what it is we're saying and why we're saying it.
So we talked earlier about Kate being a journalist. I think sometimes we also struggle with the difference between preaching and teaching. Mm-hmm. And there's some teaching that has to happen, right? We're dealing with documents that are 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 years old, and their world was different from ours. Mm-hmm. But how do you tease apart the preaching part, the teaching part? How do you make a sermon good news without taking it out of context? That's a tightrope to walk, I think.
It is. It's a tightrope to walk, and keeping in mind the purpose of the sermon helps to be the filter through which I can adjudicate how much of the information needs to be in there. By academic background, I'm a historian, and so I can go down these rabbit holes almost endlessly, but I have to control that addiction and think about what is it that people need to know, the people to whom I'm speaking need to know about Corinth or about first century Palestinian village life in order for this to make sense and not simply be incorporated into the way in which we've chosen or the way in which we've been taught to look at the world. Because sometimes we can take those words that should be profoundly challenging and make them very, very mundane.
Mm. We need to remember that Jesus was crucified for the words he said.
Exactly.
Nobody then thought what he was saying was mundane.
No.
They wouldn't have bothered if he was saying something sweet and apple pie-ish.
Mhm. And that's true. And we have to realize that while we bring our question to the text also brings questions to us. And so, in one sense, while we are reading scripture, scripture is also reading us and asking, how are you living these truths? Because these were not put together simply for the sake of filling up parchment.
Well, and probably a lot of sermons never made it to parchment.
Right, exactly.
Right on. So of another one of these comments here. Let's hear from Todd McDonald from the
Oh.
Shining Waters Regional Council.
I want to offer my congratulations to Ross Bartlett for this new book, Gathered for Preaching. When I read this book through, the image of compass came to mind, that this is a compass for new preachers especially, a compass to the art and the spiritual practice of preaching. So Ross, thanks for the new compass, the preaching compass. That will be a great gift to the church.
Did you think you were writing a compass?
I did not think that I was writing a compass, but that's good. That yeah, I mean that's one of those metaphors. Any of the metaphors that invite us to travel, to journey, to be in a new place, to go places where we haven't been before. Any of those would fit with preaching.
Struck me as I read the book, and maybe this is part of what Todd was thinking about. I mean, yeah, several people have said this is a book that's great for new preachers, and it's a short book. This is not a 300-page or 300-pound textbook, and yet, golly, I've been preaching for 35 years, and I kept thinking, yeah, that's the question. I need to think about this one again. Why am I doing this? Where's the good news? How does this make a difference? What's the call to action? Those are the kinds of things that I need to keep thinking about every time I write a sermon, not just at the beginning. Mm-hmm. So that was part of what jumped out at me for me, and maybe that's why it feels like a compass. Is that you don't give me the answers.
No,
you give me the questions, and that's much more important to me.
I'm neither qualified nor interested in providing people with answers. I would much rather walk along beside them in the written form as they discover the answers. And that's why in several places in the book, I try to encourage my colleagues in preaching, and anybody who stands in a pulpit is my colleague in preaching. I try to encourage them to find folk to talk about these things with. The preaching ministry, in a sense, can be a very solitary one because most of us work alone, and we don't get a chance to talk about the craft of preaching. If you happen to be part of a study group, a lectionary study group or whatever, then along with looking at the text, talking about the craft of conveying the message can be part of that useful interchange. So, I mean, my greatest delight would be if somebody read this, and in the days that are surely coming, saith the Lord, when we can actually get together, get a couple of people together over coffee, a couple of fellow preachers over coffee, and say, you know what this jerk wrote in this book? What do you think about it in terms of your preaching? And if people were to do that, my job's done.
Well, I don't think preachers get together all that often. This is a very solitary profession, right?
Well, we don't get together to talk about, we may get together for other purposes, but to get together to actually talk about the craft to which many of us feel a deep calling, no, we don't.
You said you don't want to give answers, and a lot of the time you don't, but you sure push us to find them. Mm-hmm. You're very clear that we need to have a faith that is thought out. And we need to be clear in our own minds and hearts what it is we trust in mm-hmm. before we get up into the pulpit. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's some wonderful parts in the book where you're saying, here's the a status quo, but we don't live in this kind of world. Here's the sort of pablum words, and then here's the crunchy questions you got to ask about that.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. When I think historically about the significance that Scripture has had in many society-changing revolutions, that for us to read it as a reinforcing of a status quo that sees people purely as economic producers or consumers, we've missed something. And there's an old saying that when you find a biblical verse making you feel comfortable, you can be almost sure that you've misread it.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes we read and we feel comfortable and we miss the grace.
I think that's important. And then there was this passage you were talking about Lent and Easter. That one jumped out at me. The Christmas one did too, but the Lent and Easter one partly just because we're coming up to Holy Week.
Yeah.
And you said, as a society, we're far better at identifying and punishing individual deeds than systemic crimes.
Mm-hmm.
We punish the individual far more seriously than the corporate, the marginalized more than the mainstream, minorities more than the dominant group.
Mm-hmm.
And so you want us to think about how that shapes our understanding of the crucifixion and what happened to Jesus and what is sin and how do we proclaim liberation and new life. You want to preach us your Easter sermon now and kind of help us understand where you're coming from on that?
As a colleague of mine says, after God's done a resurrection, what's the preacher supposed to do? But I think certainly it's part of the society in which we live, where we're much more enculturated to think about individuals. And for those of us in the dominant part of the culture, justice is primarily about my day in court, rather than recognizing the systemic realities that bring people to places of conflict with the law. We only have to look at the overrepresentation of visible minorities in courts and prisons across this land to realize that something's wrong. And Jesus was, I don't know that Jesus was as much opposed to the Romans as he was opposed to any system which ground people down, which denied their value, which denied their worth to God. And so when, and that can happen regardless of one's socioeconomic status. Another metaphor that I sometimes use is the rich and poor are the same. The rich just have a longer way to slide before they hit the knot at the bottom of the rope. And one of the reasons why the Bible has so much emphasis on the poor, the widow, the orphan, the sojourner, the stranger, the refugee, is because they don't have the buffer zone that the wealthy and established do. And that's true in our lives as well. And so when the resurrection is proclaimed, it's not just good news and new life for individuals, it's for all those who seek to live in that particular way. And ultimately, seeking to extend that justice and caring to all who are encountered.
I could go on talking about these things forever, and we don't have the time. But lest anyone think that this is only a book for lay people, we invited one of the premier teachers of preaching to comment on the book. So we spoke to Haran Kim Craig, who teaches preaching at Emmanuel College in Toronto, and here are her comments.
Congratulations, Ross. I'm delighted to witness the harvest from your 16 years of planting seeds for preaching. Like a farmer, this must have been a labor of love, dedication, patience, and faithfulness. I am especially grateful for this book because it is our own. It speaks with an United Church accent. There are so many great resources coming from the US, but many of them are not quite fitting. So it is so wonderful to have this resource that deeply and properly reflects Canadian and United Church context. Related to the theological ethos of the United Church, this book does such a fabulous job of empowering the laity, lay preachers, or people who do not have any formal theological education in homiletics. Thus, I would say this book is a gift for the whole people of God, and thanks be to God.
Amen.
I should acknowledge Hayran is here too. So
Yes.
Yay!
we're delighted you're with us. Hayran, and
Congratulations.
always fun to have you here.
Yes. Yeah, it's
So,
great.
so do you have any questions for Ross since you're here?
Well, there are so many, I mean, this little tiny chapter has so many insights to unpack and chew on. I was really delighted also that many of people mentioned something about the online. So in a way, you know, although this book started 16, 17 years ago, it's so current. And what would you say about the challenges and promises of online preaching?
I think a couple of things happen. One of the things that we're discovering is that preachers and congregations are making contact with people who would never darken the door of the church. And that may be because they live far away geographically, or they live far away socially, and wouldn't be literally caught dead, or the roof will come in if I go into church. And yet preachers across the country are reporting that the number of folk who access the services is increasing. And so I think that's a good thing. I think preaching online needs to be perhaps much more direct, perhaps much shorter. I was interested when we decided, Kate decided that it needed an extra chapter about the pandemic, which was upon us. I went out and I canvassed some of my colleagues who were preaching online, and some who had large amounts of tech support, and others who didn't. It was just an iPhone being held up, and incredible range of experiences. Most of them said they felt the need to preach shorter, more direct, less philosophical, more illustrated in concrete sermons. But a couple said, no, we have the analytics to say that I'm still preaching 15 to 18 minutes and people are hanging in there with me. So, I think it's less about the time, and more about what we do with it. But I think it has a wonderful, to use a word we don't often use in the United Church, but should use more often, it has a wonderful evangelistic potential for people who think they have an idea of what church is like, to actually encounter these people in a safe way. And one of the reasons I like that chapter is that I believe, regardless of what happens after the pandemic and so on, I think many congregations are going to have to continue to wrestle with their online presence.
That's right.
They've established something, and the question will be, how do we sustain that? How do we sustain that without destroying both clergy and laity? And then the question becomes, how do we create community?
Yes,
How do we invite new people in? So there's a whole lot of questions, but I think it's a much more direct and a much more focused form of preaching.
In many ways, that's a good preaching, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, but the other, I don't want to take too much time, but one thing that I was also thinking about when you said earlier about the preaching could be not necessarily solitary act, but collaborative act. Colleagues, and I would even extend that to the congregations.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
One of the things that I do with our students is to do the congregational exegesis, not just your own. And so then preaching event really becomes much more participatory preaching.
Yes.
And I think online does allow that because it's easy to actually ask questions.
Mhm.
Less awkward to have those kind of conversations via Zoom than
Yes.
physical space. Therefore, after we actually get together physically, congregation members might be more open to collaborative, more open-minded kind of preaching, as if the preacher has the answer to all, right? We don't have that.
We know better. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. So I think, yeah. So thank you. Thank you for
Thank
the
you.
amazing resources, and thank you to all the leaders in the church who made this possible.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. And just before you go, Haran, the other thing that jumped out at me in what you said, and I'll get back to the online thing in a minute because somebody else was commenting on that too. But you said this book speaks with a United Church accent. I think that's fascinating. I'd love to hear just a little more about what you mean, Haran, about that, and then ask Ross whether he thinks you're right.
Well, so what I mean by is that, to me, the preaching really matters the context. Even though preaching deals with the text most faithfully. So in a way, it's a dance between the context and the text, and that preaching kind of make it whole. One of the challenges I have with so many resources from the US is that they are assuming their contexts are all US. So all the examples, all the kind of things that they do we kind of know, but not exactly same. So for example, like so many indigenous related examples, issues, events should be a part of our struggles and make it to our own. And I don't see those happening at all in the US, at least in the homiletics textbooks, right? So they talk about Black and those Afro-American stories, but that's not quite exactly right, isn't it? Because our Black experience in Canada is not same. So when I read this particular book, I kind of almost smell the United Church in that sense, a little bit more rooted in our own context. The fact that Ross emphasized the importance of the context, the relevancy of that particular time with a particular space. So that makes it more real. And not just following or imitating what folks in the South, in the United States do. Not that they don't have nothing to offer, extremely great for so many preaching traditions there. But we need to have our own unique voice, like denomination identity, and something that I think we should cherish, our own legacies and heritages. And this is one of those. And so I'm really grateful for that.
Thanks, Haran. Ross, understanding your audience is a big part of this book. You spend a lot of words on that. Just respond to Haran a little bit, but tell us about kind of how you see that as important.
Even though the gospel doesn't change, the capacity of people, of those who are listening, to take in the words of the preacher change. And one of the advantages that I've had of being in different parts of the country and of the world is to recognize that saying some things in some places, they don't literally translate to other places. One of my experiences was to define that an expression that I would use quite regularly in Canada was actually quite rude when I was in Australia. That was an eye opener to language. But this similarly, if you're going to use an illustration in a sermon in the prairies, a fishing illustration from the Maritimes won't connect in the same way, or maybe saying something entirely out of context. So it's important for the preacher to recognize the context into which they are speaking, the socioeconomics of the situation, and what is true in the expression of the gospel, perhaps in downtown Toronto is going to be very different than in Outport, Newfoundland, is going to be very different from a farming community in the prairies and so on. So sermons and illustrations are not easily transportable. And I think we can often tell sermons that are prepared for a, dare we say, a generic audience rather than a specific congregation. Fred Craddock used to teach the practice of empathetic imagination, inviting preachers with congregations that they knew to each week try and think their way into the mind and situation of the parishioners. This isn't meant to be psychotherapy or diagnostic, but what would what I'm saying mean to, or how would it be heard by the single parent who is trying to raise kids, the partner whose loved one is slipping into dementia, the person, the couple who've just had their wildest dreams come true? How are these things going to be heard? And there's something very powerful when people hear the gospel told back to them in their own stories. When the gospel ceases to be something that happens to somebody else somewhere else, but we can see the light of the gospel shining on our community, and so and shining through our stories, and that really, really resonates with folk.
Thanks, Ross. I'm going to play timekeeper because we're going to hit the top of the hour soon, and I have one.
Cabbage rolls are going to burn. Oh,
Yeah,
no.
absolutely. No, I'm looking forward to those cabbage rolls. But in the meantime, I have one more pre-recorded tribute here that I wanted to share with you.
Hi there. I'm here in Edmonton on the banks of the North Saskatchewan. Yep, it's a dry cold. Ross, thank you for the book. Great stuff. And for those of us who are preaching outside our sanctuaries because of COVID, there's a whole chapter in here on preaching online. Thanks. Enjoy the book launch.
And Catherine's here as well. I think.
Catherine is here too. Yeah. So Catherine, thank you for that.
Yes.
And you gave me this wonderful in to talking about preaching during the pandemic. Catherine isn't live streaming. She's pre-recording and going out to different parts of the city every week that seems to resonate with her message. I think there's a plethora of ways to respond to preaching online, and wonder if you want to kind of hold some of those up.
Well, yeah, I have to say I'm filled with awe at our colleagues who most of the time would have said, oh, we'll never have an online ministry. We're not big enough. We're not important enough. And within a couple of weeks made an incredible pivot to doing worship online. And you should all be complimenting yourselves, because that was really quite a gift. And I've seen people doing worship from a variety of places. Some, like Catherine and others, are doing parts of the service or all of the service outside. Some are doing it worship from their living room. Some are using the sanctuary empty of people. Some, now that churches are opening up a little bit, are doing some sort of hybrid or combined. And less important than, this won't surprise you, less important to me about where you do it is why you choose to do it there. It's not just about something that will be cute or trendy or whatever, but do you have a reason? And most of my colleagues who have been preaching in non-sanctuary locations have a reason. They're doing it for a purpose. And when that purpose blends together with the message, blends together with the text that's being wrestled with, wonderful things happen.
Thank you. So Catherine is here, and I thought I should give her the same opportunity we gave Hayran, just to tell us something that I didn't have in the can. So Catherine, come and add to our conversation.
Well, thanks very much. Ross, it's a great book, and I'm so happy to have it on my shelf and get copies for friends and colleagues. And I was very touched that you asked me to write the foreword. Thank you very much for that. My preaching professor, one of my preaching professors, was Fred Buechner. And part of what he said was that in preaching, every week, as we do it over and over and over and over, we need to be convincing people that the gospel is real. And one of the ways that we do that is convincing people that we are real.
Oh, yes.
And in the chapter on taking things online, we have an opportunity to do that now in ways that we never had before.
Right.
I'm outside the church because nobody else can go in, so it seems fair that I'm outside. But in choosing where to go, you're right, it shouldn't be simply entertaining, although there's nothing wrong with entertainment. But video enhances. There's a whole lot of other learnings and opportunities. When Hiran was talking about asking questions, you can do that in a video differently. And so places around a city, you know, a river, a road, those are, you can go a long way with those in the gospel readings.
Yes.
But there are other art installations and sports complexes and things that just by the location deepen the message that is being offered.
Yep.
So I thought it was so important that you included something in preaching online because it can be intimidating. But once we get over the intimidation, it is so much fun because we get to be real people, right? As we are real preachers. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah.
And preaching ought to be fun
Yes.
for us and for the people listening to us.
Yeah, for the most part. Yep.
Darn right. Thank you. Let me bring up Rebecca. Rebecca is the manager of our bookstore, and we're coming close to the end of our hour, but I wanted to make sure that Rebecca had a chance to say her piece and also share the promo code that I promised you at the beginning.
Hi, everyone. Good evening or good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Hornberg, and I'm the manager for UCRD Store, which is United Church Bookstore. And we are thrilled to have this amazing title now available on our site. And I believe that a lot of you are probably excited about the offer that I'm about to share with you. So until midnight in BC, so 3 a.m. I guess technically if you're my time zone, you can use code GATHERED21 and get 21% off the retail price. And it works both for the physical copy or the e-version, so the ebook copy, if you're more interested in downloading it to your e-reader of choice. And again, Ross, congratulations on this book. As a bookstore manager, I receive a lot of inquiries, and this is definitely the type of book that we have received questions for. So I am thrilled and excited to finally have it in my hands and be working with you to promoting it and ensuring that it gets into both experienced and new preachers.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank
So
you for
I
that
see-
support.
I see that Kate Rod has put that promo code into the chat, which is lovely. And I've put a link that will take you directly to either the ebook or the paper book. So I can change the slide and offer everyone a little bit of wine and cheese to celebrate the rest of the
I
evening.
would like to do the same. Yum, yum, yum. No book launch without some crackers and cheese.
Exactly. Right.